How could a nation that had just been formed, with a divided territory and a population mostly without military experience, deal such a decisive blow to a superpower that ruled the world? In this script, we will dive deep into the true story of this titanic struggle. We will reveal the key moments and intelligent strategies that the United States used to challenge the British Empire and, in a bold and courageous manner, weaken its global dominance. Get ready to discover how the Americans, through courage, daring, and an unwavering vision of freedom, changed the course of history and dealt a fatal blow to the British Empire. At the height of its imperial supremacy, the British Empire viewed its colonies as essential pillars that sustained its vast network of wealth, power, and influence. The idea that a distant colony across the Atlantic could pose a real threat seemed absurd to the eyes of London. In the British perception, the United States was nothing more than a cluster of remote, sparsely populated lands inhabited by young and inexperienced settlers whose resources and military structure could barely be compared to those of the Empire. To the British, these colonists would never be able to unite or even defend themselves, much less challenge the order established by Her Majesty. However, this way of thinking was about to be challenged by an invisible yet immeasurable force: the idea of the right to freedom, self-determination, and resistance to tyranny. As the 18th century progressed, American colonists began to realize they were being constantly oppressed by British power, which controlled their lives, economies, and freedoms. Exorbitant taxes on essential goods like tea, glass, and paper, taxes that were imposed without any political representation in decisions made by the British Parliament, fueled the growing discontent among the colonists. The famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," became a rallying cry against British policies, which, besides burdening the American population, completely disregarded their needs and desires. To the British, it was simple. The colonies should contribute their resources to sustain the empire and its wars. For the Americans, however, this became a matter of dignity and principles. Over the years, the colonists' resentment only grew, with new laws being imposed without their consent, such as the Stamp Act of 1765 and the Townshend Acts of 1767, which reinforced Britain's control over the colonial economy. In response to these impositions, protests, demonstrations, and a sense of unity between the colonies began to emerge, something that had seemed improbable until then. Groups like the Sons of Liberty took to the streets, igniting revolutionary fervor and creating a wave of civil disobedience. It was in 1773, when the British imposed the Tea Act, that tensions reached their peak. The famous Boston Tea Party, where colonists disguised as Native Americans dumped tons of tea into Boston Harbor in protest, was the spark that sealed the colony's fate. The British response was fierce. With the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, the British sought to suffocate American resistance by closing the port of Boston and placing the city under military control. But instead of breaking the colonists' resolve, this only fueled the fire of rebellion. In this atmosphere of growing tension, the ideas of liberty and a new model of government began to gain traction. The colonists began to realize that their strength did not lie only in the vast lands and natural resources of the colonies, but in the ideas circulating in their meetings and debates. Influenced by Enlightenment philosophies that championed natural rights and the social contract, Americans began to see themselves as citizens of a new world, ready to seek a new path, free from imperial rule. And it was from this growing awareness that the American Revolution began to take shape. The idea of independence was no longer a distant dream, but a tangible reality. The spark of the revolt was not just the direct oppression of the British Empire, but the realization that the American colonists, united by a common cause, could achieve something grand: independence and the building of a nation founded on the principles of liberty, equality, and justice. The American Revolution was not merely a military response to a distant empire. It was the awakening of a new way of thinking about government and society. It was the confirmation that a people, driven by their ideas and values, could change the course of history. And this movement of resistance, led by figures such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin, was beginning to transform the United States into a new symbol of hope for the world, a promise that ideas could, in fact, defeat the weapons of an empire. On the horizon, a war was about to begin, a war that would not only be for the independence of the colonies, but also for the very shift in the balance of power in the world. The American colonists were about to challenge the British Empire in a struggle that, although it seemed unequal, was based on something much more powerful: the desire to be free, to be sovereign over their own destiny. And with this, the British Empire was beginning to see, for the first time, a real and unexpected threat forming. A threat that would forever change the course of history. The American Revolution was not just a war for the right to self-determination. Above all, it was a cry of resistance against the oppression of an empire that considered itself eternal. For many, the idea of a colony rebelling against the world's greatest power at the time seemed like an act of desperation, a futile attempt destined for failure. But what the British Empire failed to foresee was the transformative power of the idea of freedom that blossomed in the 13 colonies. Although it was a young colony, made up of a population with little significant military experience, without a professional army or sophisticated equipment, the Americans gathered challenging forces, willing to fight with everything they had for their freedom. What the colonists lacked in material resources, they compensated with burning passion and a spirit of unity, forming an army made up of men from different backgrounds, but with one common purpose: to achieve their freedom at any cost. In a setting where the lack of formal training and supplies was a constant, what stood out was the willpower and the high morale that the Patriots carried. One of the decisive moments that truly challenged British rule was the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. This confrontation is often seen as the turning point in the war, as it was not only a crucial strategic victory for the Americans, but also a psychological victory that changed the global perception of the colonists' potential for resistance. Saratoga not only weakened the British lines, but also demonstrated that, with visionary leadership, the Americans could indeed take on an empire. The impact of this victory was enormous, not just on the battlefield, but in international politics. The victory at Saratoga was the key to France's entry into the conflict. The French nation, led by a monarchy that held a historic rivalry with Great Britain, saw a unique opportunity to weaken its ancient enemy and, at the same time, deal a devastating blow to the heart of the British Empire. France's entry into the war was not just a military support, but a determining factor in the war of attrition that followed. French assistance was of vital importance. It included the sending of experienced troops, vital supplies, and, perhaps most critically of all, essential financial support for the American war efforts. With France providing substantial aid, Spain also entered the conflict more indirectly, offering financial and strategic support. The involvement of these foreign powers expanded the scope of the conflict, creating an international coalition against the British and forcing them to fight on multiple fronts, with resources already scarce due to the war's wear on their own forces. What truly weakened the British Empire was the combination of its inability to effectively respond to the American resistance and the external pressure from its former rival powers. With France, Spain, and other nations taking sides, the British Empire found itself overwhelmed by a prolonged and extremely costly conflict. It was not just the financial cost of maintaining armed forces, but the difficulty of maintaining control over the territories at war, which began to erode the morale and confidence of the British in their ability to win. The logistics of war, which had once seemed favorable to the empire, became a nightmare. Great Britain was forced to fight in multiple directions, unable to maintain an efficient supply and communication line between the metropolis and its colonies, making the war effort increasingly unsustainable. The American Revolution was not only a fight for the colonists' freedom, but a turning point in the global balance of power. While the Americans fought for their independence, they were also creating a new paradigm for the world, one in which military power was not the only determinant of victory, but the unity of ideas of freedom, strategy, and international diplomacy. The American victory at Saratoga, followed by the entry of European powers, was the final blow that exposed the weaknesses of the British Empire, marking the beginning of its decline in the Americas. The war, which began as a simple conflict of interests, transformed into a revolutionary process that not only weakened the British Empire, but also altered the future of global politics forever. In 1783, after a long and arduous conflict, the American Revolution reached its climax with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. This historic victory not only solidified the independence of the United States, but also had a profound and irreversible impact on the British Empire. The British, who until then had considered their colonies in the New World an unquestionable extension of their imperial dominance, were forced to recognize the loss of one of their largest and most profitable territories. The signing of the treaty meant more than the liberation of a rebellious colony. It represented the beginning of a new global order. The Treaty of Paris was not just a military milestone, but also a true economic blow to the British Empire. The loss of the American colonies meant the extinction of a vast consumer market and an abundant source of natural resources that fed British factories and trade. For centuries, the American colonies had been a key pillar of British prosperity, providing raw materials such as tobacco, cotton, and sugar, as well as being a vital market for manufactured goods. This market was suddenly wiped out, forcing the British to reassess their economic and political strategies. The break with the American colonies was not only a material loss, but also a psychological and strategic one. For the British Empire, losing its most valuable colonies was a bitter lesson about the limits of imperial power. Until that point, the empire had believed that its military strength and vast colonial network were invulnerable. But the success of the United States in challenging this established order showed that even the most powerful empires could be defeated by external forces. This setback exposed the vulnerabilities of an empire that spanned continents and oceans, making it increasingly difficult to maintain control over its vast territories. Furthermore, the loss of the North American colonies forced the British Empire into a critical reassessment of its priorities. Maintaining a massive naval fleet and an army spread across various parts of the world came at an immense cost, both financially and in human terms. The weakening of Britain's finances after the war and the loss of its colonies sparked an internal debate about the viability of further imperial expansion. The pressure to cut costs and focus efforts on other parts of the world, such as India and Africa, became more evident. At the same time, the now independent United States began to consolidate itself as a new power, with vast natural resources and a growing population. While the British Empire was still a dominant global force, the rise of the United States brought a new dynamic to the international stage, challenging British supremacy. More than that, the United States was in a strategic position to become a new economic, political, and later, military rival. This economic blow marked the beginning of a long and painful process for the British Empire. The loss of control over the American market, one of its greatest sources of wealth and power, had repercussions throughout the empire. The dependence on the colonies to keep the imperial machinery running became increasingly unsustainable. And while the British Empire expanded in other directions, such as in Asia and Africa, the shadow of the American loss was never fully erased. Throughout the 19th century, the British Empire would struggle to redefine its global influence, while the United States positioned itself as the emerging new power. The victory of the United States was not just a military triumph, but the beginning of an economic and geopolitical transformation. The British Empire, one of the most formidable powers in history, began to feel the first cracks that would eventually widen, culminating in the gradual decline of its global dominance. The independence of the United States not only weakened the British Empire, but also forever altered the balance of power between nations, establishing the United States as an emerging force that would challenge the supremacy of the British Empire and other powers throughout the 19th century and beyond. While the British Empire struggled to recover from the devastating impacts of losing its American colonies and the scars left by the American Revolution, the United States was undergoing a profound internal transformation. The process of industrialization, which had begun in Great Britain at the end of the 18th century, was now being imitated in a bolder and faster way by Americans, establishing a new paradigm in the global economic landscape. In the early years of the 19th century, Great Britain was still the world's leading industrial power. Its factories, looms, and mines were among the most advanced in the world, and it dominated global trade routes with its colonial empire. However, while the British focused on managing their vast colonies and trying to restore their power after the war, the United States was doing something different. Instead of remaining restricted to an agricultural economy, as much of the world still did, the Americans were developing new technologies and production methods that would completely transform their economy. What happened in the United States during the Industrial Revolution was revolutionary and faster than many had anticipated. Unlike the slow adaptation that Great Britain experienced in the early decades of the 19th century, the United States not only mimicked British innovations, but improved and expanded their application on a much more ambitious scale. With a vast territory rich in natural resources like coal, iron, timber, and oil, the country was able to be self-sufficient in raw materials essential for industrialization, an advantage that the British Empire did not possess in its entirety. American factories, powered by a workforce made up of both European immigrants and a growing domestic market, began to produce on a scale never seen before. The United States quickly became one of the largest global producers of manufactured goods. The construction of railroads also played a key role in accelerating this process. The vast distances between American cities and the need to connect urban areas to rural regions and ports resulted in a national railroad system that was, by far, one of the largest infrastructure undertakings ever carried out at the time. Railroads not only facilitated the transport of goods and raw materials from coast to coast, but they also opened new markets, both domestic and international. Technological innovation was one of the primary drivers behind this phenomenon. In the United States, engineers and inventors like Eli Whitney with his invention of the cotton gin and Robert Fulton with the development of the steamboat played essential roles in expanding productive capacities and increasing efficiency. Factories began to rely on new machinery that dramatically increased production, while mass production methods became more sophisticated and profitable, allowing the United States to become more than just a supplier of raw materials. The growing industrialization of the United States also coincided with the growth of cities and the rise of internal migration. While Great Britain still depended on its colonies for supplies and markets, the United States was beginning to build its own network of cities and industrial centers, creating a self-sustaining growth cycle. Unlike European powers, which were immersed in colonial disputes and facing the challenges of managing distant empires, the United States was focused on consolidating its position on the continent and gradually projecting its power beyond its borders. By the end of the 19th century, the United States was no longer just a young, newly independent nation. It had become an industrial power that, even without a colonial empire, held economic power capable of rivaling the greatest powers of the time. The revolution in factories and the technological innovation of the United States not only strengthened its economy impressively, but also helped establish the country as a new global leader. While the British were still focused on preserving the empire, the United States, with its growing industrial power and new forms of production, was beginning to challenge them strategically. It was no longer just an economic competition, but a fight for control over new technologies and the direction of the global economic future. The rise of the United States as a global economic power began to be perceived by the British, who could no longer maintain world hegemony as they once did, with a new and powerful adversary emerging on the horizon. This rivalry was not just a clash of economies, but also a conflict of mindsets. While the British were still anchored in an era of empires and global markets based on colonies, the United States was rapidly advancing toward a new type of economy, more dynamic, focused on the production of innovative goods and services. British global dominance was weakening, and the new power emerging in the Americas was beginning to solidify its place on the international stage. America's Industrial Revolution, in its rapid rise, not only strengthened the nation but also challenged the world order that the British had dominated for centuries. And it was from this industrial base that the United States continued to expand its influence, both on the continent and beyond, culminating in a new role for the country as a global power in the 20th century. In the 19th century, the rivalry between the United States and the British Empire intensified in a decisive way. However, unlike previous decades, When Americans were fighting for basic survival and for independence from an oppressive crown, the situation had changed. The U.S. was no longer a colony seeking freedom. It was now forging a new identity and position on the global stage, with ambitions that went far beyond simple autonomy. The goal was clear: to become a global power, even eclipsing the dominance of its former mother country. The decisive turning point came in 1823 with the formulation of the Monroe Doctrine, which can be considered the cornerstone of American foreign policy for several generations. By declaring that the Western Hemisphere would henceforth be a U.S. sphere of influence, Monroe was not merely asserting a position of power. He was drawing the boundaries of a new empire of ideas and ambitions. With this declaration, the United States was telling the world, and especially Great Britain, that its era of dominance in the Americas was coming to an end. The impact of this doctrine was profound. Although it was not a direct attack, the message was unmistakable. Latin America and neighboring regions would now be shielded from the imperial interests of European powers, especially Great Britain, which until then had held vast colonial interests in the region. In a strategic move, the U.S. began consolidating its political and economic influence, pushing foreign powers away, particularly the British, who still maintained some colonies in the Caribbean and North America, such as Bermuda and the West Indies. As powerful as the British Empire still was, with an unmatched navy and an undeniable global presence, the United States was steadily rising, backed by a robust economy and an expansionist spirit that would soon take shape in the idea of manifest destiny. This was not merely a matter of foreign policy, but a true redefinition of the dynamics of world power. Great Britain, which had once seen itself as the unquestioned master of the Americas, began to watch its interests being undermined. The rise of the United States introduced a new geopolitical rivalry that reflected a paradigm shift. The British were increasingly fighting to preserve an existing world order, while the Americans were racing to establish a new one. The U.S. movement of territorial expansion also had a direct impact in this context. The annexation of Texas in 1845 and, later, the Mexican-American War, which resulted in the acquisition of vast territories including California, Arizona, New Mexico, and others, were part of a broader strategy to consolidate territorial and economic supremacy. At the same time, tensions rose between the U.S. and Great Britain in the Pacific region, with disputes over territories such as Oregon. Although Great Britain yielded in several of these disputes, acknowledging the growing power and influence of the United States, it never stopped maintaining its strategic presence, especially in trade routes and relations with Asian powers. Behind the scenes, the Industrial Revolution was reshaping global dynamics. Although the United States was not the birthplace of that revolution, it was rapidly adopting new technologies, such as the telegraph and the railroad, that revolutionized communication and transportation. This gave the U.S. a strategic economic advantage over the British Empire, which was already grappling with the challenges of managing a global empire. With territories spread across every corner of the world, the British Empire was increasingly struggling to effectively control all of its possessions and resources. Its attention was divided among countless colonies and regions around the globe, making it vulnerable to new challenges. And while Great Britain was occupied with administering and defending its empire, the United States, free from such burdens, could grow in a more focused and, in many cases, faster way. On the other hand, the British were beginning to realize that they could no longer sustain the same imperial posture in the Americas. The U.S. economy was expanding, with agriculture, industry, and trade flourishing. And although the British still held naval supremacy, they were facing increasingly fierce competition. Economic pressure, combined with technological advances in the United States, was altering the balance of power. The possibility of open war between the two powers was far from desirable for either side, but political, economic, and ideological competition was intensifying. The 19th century, therefore, not only witnessed the growth of the United States, but also the gradual weakening of an empire that had once seemed indestructible. The British imperial system, with its vast network of colonies and global trade, was being challenged by a new force. The United States, driven by self-determination, expansion, and innovation. With the Monroe Doctrine, the US planted the seed of a new world order, one in which Great Britain would come to play a secondary role in the Americas, while the United States would begin shaping the future of the region, leading with a vision of greatness that had long been beyond the imagination of any of the nations involved. Although the British Empire managed to survive into the 20th century, it already carried the seeds of its collapse. However, it was World War II that marked the definitive turning point. The global conflict, which devastated nations around the world, had a devastating impact on Great Britain. Although it emerged victorious, the war left the nation deeply wounded, economically and politically drained. The war effort demanded immense resources, and even with the victory, the United Kingdom was on the brink of ruin. The British economy, already weakened since the early 1900s, was completely disorganized by the war. The expenses of maintaining military forces, rebuilding devastated cities, and investing in a range of new military technologies drained the empire's coffers. Moreover, the colonies, which had once generated wealth through their raw materials and labor, also suffered the effects of the war. Britain had to rely on massive loans from the United States, revealing a shift in global positions. By the end of the war, it was clear. The British were in decline, while the United States was emerging as the world's greatest power, with the strongest economy, a more assertive political leadership, and unparalleled military power. As Britain tried to deal with its debts and rebuild its infrastructure, a new reality was taking shape. The former colonies, now deeply affected by the war and imperial policies, began to question the legitimacy of British rule. The empire, which had once held almost absolute control over vast portions of the globe, found itself increasingly unable to maintain its authority. The colonized peoples, who had been marginalized and exploited for centuries, were becoming more aware of their collective power. Internal and external tensions within the empire were about to explode. India was the first to follow the path to independence. In 1947, after decades of resistance and struggles for freedom, the Indians finally achieved their emancipation. India's victory was a profound blow to Britain, which had viewed its colonies in Asia as vital to its wealth and international prestige. The loss of India was not just a territorial loss, but the loss of a symbol of its imperial grandeur. India was the heart of the empire, and its separation marked the beginning of the end for British dominance. In the years that followed, the domino effect spread. Other colonies began to seek their own independence, following India's example. In 1957, Ghana in Africa became the first African country to gain its independence. This decolonization movement spread throughout Africa and the Caribbean in the following decades, with countries such as Nigeria, Kenya, Egypt, and Jamaica gaining their autonomy. Each of these nations had been a vital part of the British Empire, and their departure caused the empire to fragment even further. Britain, which had once controlled vast areas of Africa and Asia, saw its colonies become independent while its global power diminished. Meanwhile, the United States continued its rise. In 1945, at the end of World War II, the US emerged as the world's greatest economic, military, and political power. With the end of the British Empire, the United States filled the power vacuum left by Britain. American leadership was solidified during the Cold War, when the country positioned itself as the leader of the Western Bloc against the Soviet Union. Not only militarily, but also economically, with the Marshall Plan and other initiatives that helped rebuild war-torn Europe, the United States established itself as the leading global power. The final collapse of the British Empire was an inevitable process, but it was accelerated by World War II. In attempting to maintain a global empire while dealing with the consequences of the war, Britain found itself unable to sustain its position. The power shift was clear. While the British Empire weakened and crumbled, the United States consolidated itself as the new global empire, dominating politics, the economy, and global culture. This historical moment not only represented the end of an era of imperial domination, but also marked the rise of a new world order. The 20th century witnessed the decline of one superpower and the emergence of another, with the United States taking its place at the top of the world. As the former colonies gained their independence, the US consolidated its status as the global leader, with an impact that still reverberates today in international relations. The British Empire, which for centuries controlled vast portions of the planet, was crumbling. And in its place, the United States was rising, setting a new standard of power and influence that would redefine the 20th century and beyond. The collapse of the empire was not just a territorial loss, but the end of a model of domination that, for so long, seemed invincible. The future would now be written by a new power, the United States of America. The British Empire, which for centuries dominated vast parts of the globe, began to see its final days of power after World War II. Although Britain managed, with great sacrifices, to maintain its place in the international arena as a relevant power, the cost of the war was a fatal blow to its imperial structure. The colossus that had dominated lands and seas with its invincible navy and imposing armies was about to be reduced to a shadow of its former self. World War II not only destroyed vast areas of Europe and left millions of lives lost, but it also drained the economies of the countries involved. Britain, although one of the victors, came out of the conflict with its economy in tatters, its infrastructure destroyed, and its population devastated. The need for reconstruction was immense, and Britain, already facing growing resistance within its colonies, lacked the resources or the will to maintain its empire. Meanwhile, the United States emerged from the war as the greatest global power. Not only did they manage to remain physically intact during the conflict, but their economy also thrived, fueled by mass production and the necessary armaments for the war effort. The economic, political, and military strength of the United States became unbeatable. The country was no longer a rising power. It was now the pillar of the new global balance of power. Britain, exhausted and weakened, knew that the rise of the United States meant the diminishment of its imperial power, a transition that would forever change the course of world history. With the war over, Britain's former colonies began to take a firm stance on their independence. The colonial powers, burdened by the costs of the war and the growing pressure from independence movements, no longer had the same capacity to maintain control over their vast domains. The collapse of the empire was inevitable. India, which had been the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, was the first and most significant example of this paradigm shift. In 1947, after years of peaceful resistance led by figures such as Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, India gained its independence. This victory was symbolic, representing the end of centuries of British colonial rule in Asia. But India was not the only one. The independence movement spread across Africa and the Caribbean, where nations began to challenge British authority with growing vigor. The former colonies, now exhausted by the war and the weight of imperial oppression, were clamoring for freedom. The pressure for self-determination became unbearable, and the colonial powers realized that the game had changed. Promises of liberty and sovereignty became reality in a series of movements that culminated in a new post-colonial world. In the decades that followed, former British colonies, from India to the African continent, gained their independence, one after another. Each nation that became free represented a loss for the empire, and the impact of this was deeply felt in London, where the loss of the colonies meant economic weakening and the decline of political influence. The British Empire, which once ruled vast portions of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, was crumbling. Other European colonial powers, such as France and Belgium, were also facing similar challenges, but the British Empire, due to its history of global dominance, felt the weight of these transformations more acutely. At the same time, the United States, which had solidified itself as an uncontested global power, became the new leader of the Western world. The end of the British Empire was, in a sense, the beginning of a new era, an era in which the US would take center stage with its thriving economy, democratic political system, and global military presence. The transition from British dominance to American supremacy was gradual but firm, marking the end of an imperial era and the birth of a new world order. The story of the decline of the British Empire and the rise of the United States is one of the most fascinating narratives of the 20th century, as it illustrates not only the end of an empire, but also the birth of a new international order. And as the former British colonies took their place on the global stage, the United States, with its growing power, was ready to shape the future of the world with unprecedented influence. Did you enjoy learning how the United States changed the course of history and weakened the British Empire? Like and share this content with your friends and family. Let's continue exploring more powerful stories like this. Subscribe to the channel and don't miss our upcoming videos.